I've been working as a park ranger in some of the most secluded, untouched parks in the country for over 20 years now. Over that time I've seen and experienced a lot, both beautiful and strange, but there's one event from a few years ago that still makes my skin crawl every time I think about it. It was late October and the forest was alive with color. The trees were a patchwork of reds, oranges, and yellows, and the crisp, cool air smelled like pine and earth. The summer crowds had mostly gone, leaving the park empty and quiet. It was the perfect time for us to go about our routine maintenance, cleaning up the campsites, checking for any damage to the trails, and making sure everything was in order before the winter set. And that evening, as the sun began to set behind the distant mountains, I made my final rounds. The last campsite I needed to check was Site 12, a remote spot deep in the park. It wasn't a popular site, which made it perfect for people who wanted solitude. When I arrived, something immediately struck me. As out, a small tent was set up in the middle of the campsite, but everything around it looked abandoned. The fire pit was cold with only a few scattered ashes left, and the wood surrounding it hadn't been touched for hours. I called out, hoping to hear someone respond, "Hey, anyone?" The wind carried my voice through the trees, but there was no answer. Silent, I walked closer, my boots crunching against the frozen ground, and that's when I noticed the tent flap. It was open gently, swaying in the breeze as if someone had just walked away, but the campsite was empty. I felt a knot form in my stomach. No signs of any movement, no footprints leading out, nothing. I pulled out my flashlight and shone it inside the tent. It was completely empty. No camping gear, no sleeping bags, no backpacks, nothing, just a crumpled map lying on the ground, its edges curling in the cold air. A sense of unease settled over me. This wasn't right. I immediately radioed my partner Mike, who was stationed a few miles away. "Mike, you need to come to Site 12. Something's off here. There's no sign of anyone, but their stuff is all gone." Mike didn't waste any time. He made his way over, and about 10 minutes later I saw him coming through the trees, his face looking more serious than usual. "What's going on?" Mike asked as he approached. I pointed at the tent. "Found it like this camp's deserted, no sign of anyone." Mike scanned the area, his eyes narrowing as he looked around. "This doesn't make sense. Who leaves their tent like this in the middle of nowhere?" We decided to start a search, moving through the trees, calling out to see if anyone was hiding or in trouble. The park, usually alive with the sounds of wildlife, was eerily quiet. The only noise was the crunch of our boots on the leaf-strewn ground. It felt like the forest itself was holding its breath. We followed a faint trail of broken branches that led away from the campsite. After walking for about 100 yards, we came across a backpack, its contents spilled out onto the ground. There were clothes, some food wrappers, a flashlight, and a half-empty bottle of water. It looked like someone had been in a hurry, dropping things as they ran. "Looks like they were trying to get away fast," Mike muttered, crouching down to examine the scattered items. "Or they were forced to leave," I replied, scanning the trees around us, my instincts telling me something was wrong. As we moved deeper into the woods, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The air felt thick, heavy with silence, and every small sound, wind rustling the leaves, birds calling in the distance, seemed louder than it should have been. The forest felt wrong, like it was hiding something. Then we heard a low, pained moan, barely audible, but enough to send a chill down my spine. Without thinking, we sprinted toward the sound, our flashlights cutting through the darkness as we pushed through thick underbrush. After a few minutes of running, we found him, a man slumped against a tree, his clothes torn and his face bruised, eyes wide with fear. "Thank God you're here," he gasped, his voice barely above a whisper. His hands shook as he reached out for me. "They took her. They took Sarah." I crouched down beside him, my heart pounding in my chest. "Who took her? Who did this to you?" "Two guys," he whispered, his voice trembling with fear. "They came into our camp. They had guns. They said they wanted money. We didn't have much. I tried to fight," but his voice broke, and for a moment he just stared at me helplessly, and Terrified, "Where is she?" I asked, my voice tight with urgency. "Where did they take her?" "They took her. They said if I followed they'd hurt her." I tried to stop them, but he trailed off looking lost, like the memory was too much for him. I nodded and immediately called in the situation to dispatch. I requested backup and a search team, knowing we had to find Sarah before it was too late. The forest was already growing dark, and I knew the longer we waited, the harder it would be to track anyone as night fell. The forest became a maze of shadows. We split up, covering as much ground as we could, but the dark felt like it was swallowing us whole. We used every tool we had: search dogs, drones, extra rangers, but nothing was giving us answers. Hours passed. My mind raced with worst-case scenarios. What had happened to Sarah? Were the men still out there? Were they watching us right now, waiting to make their next move? Finally, just when I thought we couldn't keep going, the dogs picked up a scent. We followed them through thick brush, our flashlights flickering in the wind, and after what felt like an eternity, we found her. Sarah tied to a tree deep in the woods. Her clothes were torn and her face was pale with fear, but she was alive. When we untied her, she clung to me, her voice hoarse. "They left when they heard you coming. They said they'd be back if we told anyone, if we called for help. We got her out of there as quickly as we could, but the men who had done this were long gone." Law enforcement swept through the area. The park was closed for a full week and every inch of the land was searched, but we never found the men. They vanished without a trace. The couple, shaken and traumatized, moved away not long after, seeking a life far from the woods that had nearly destroyed them. As for me, the park will never feel the same. I've spent countless hours patrolling these forests, and now every step feels heavier. The beauty of the wild is undeniable, but now I know it can also hide the darkest of intentions. When I sit by my campfire now, listening to the crackle of the flames and the whisper of the wind through the trees, I can't help but feel like I'm not entirely alone. The forest is always watching, always listening, and sometimes, even when you think you're safe, there's something or someone lurking just out of sight. That knowledge, that unsettling feeling, has become a part of me, and I never forget the quiet, the way the woods hold their breath, waiting. The flickering campfire threw long dancing shadows across our faces. We sat in a small circle, 3 park rangers deep in the wilderness on a routine patrol. The forest around us felt alive, the night thick with the smell of pine needles and damp earth. A gentle wind whispered through the trees, carrying the occasional creak of branches and the distant hoot of an owl. It was the kind of night that felt endless, where time seemed to stretch. Under the vast canopy of stars, we had been talking in hushed voices, sharing stories from previous patrols, when Ranger Mike suddenly stiffened. His face turned pale, his eyes darting toward the darkness beyond the fir light. "You guys hear that?" he whispered, his voice barely audible over the crackle of the flames. Sarah and I froze, our chatter cut off mid-sentence. We all leaned forward, straining our ears. At first I heard nothing, just the usual forest sounds, the rustle of leaves, the distant chirp of crickets. Then it came low and deep, a guttural growl that sent a chill down my spine. It wasn't just a sound, it was a vibration, something you could feel in your bones. "Bear," I said, my voice steady despite the fear crawling up my neck. My hand instinctively went to my belt with a canister of pepper spray. "Hunt, stay close to the fire." The growl came again, louder this time and closer. Sarah's hand trembled as she gripped her flashlight. The firelight, once warm and comforting, now seemed weak against the impenetrable darkness surrounding us. The forest, which had felt so peaceful just minutes before, now felt alive with menace. Suddenly there was a sharp snap, the unmistakable sound of a branch breaking underfoot. It came from somewhere behind us. We all turned at once, our flashlights cutting through the blackness, their beams bouncing off tree trunks and dense undergrowth. "Did you hear that?" Sarah stammered, her voice shaking. I nodded, my throat too dry to speak. The sound of snapping branches wasn't unusual in the forest, but this felt different. Whatever it It was big and it was close. We need to move. I finally managed, my voice low but firm. Pack up quickly. And quietly we scrambled to our feet, dousing the fire with dirt and water. The growls hadn't stopped. In fact, they seemed to grow louder, echoing from somewhere deeper in the forest. Every sound, the crunch of leaves under our boots, the rustle of gear being stuffed into backpacks, seemed amplified, as if the forest itself was listening. Which way, Sarah asked, her eyes wide and panicked. Back toward the trail, I said. Stick together and keep your lights on. We moved quickly, but the forest wasn't easy to navigate in the dark. The ground was uneven, littered with roots and rocks that threatened to trip us with every step. Branches snagged at our clothes and scratched our faces. The growling followed us, growing fainter at times, but never disappearing entirely. It felt like we were being hunted. I think we're losing it, Sarah said, gasping for breath. Don't stop, I urged, my own legs burning from the effort. We're not safe yet. Then, as we pushed through a particularly dense thicket, something shiny caught the moonlight up ahead. We slowed, our flashlight sweeping over the object. It was metal, sharp and jagged. A trap. That's not for bears, Mike muttered, his face pale as he crouched to examine it. The trap was large, with cruel teeth designed to snap shut on anything that triggered. It was rigged to a heavy log suspended above the path, ready to crush its prey. Poachers, I said the word, leaving a bitter taste in my mouth. Poachers weren't just a threat to the animals we were sworn to protect. They were dangerous to anyone who got in their way. And now we were on their turf. As we studied the trap, a rustle in the bushes made us freeze. My heart pounded so loudly I was sure it would give us away. Slowly, I turned my flashlight toward the sound. Two figures stepped out from the shadows, their faces hidden by the hoods of their jackets. One of them carried a rifle slung over his shoulder. Don't move, Mike shouted, his voice firm despite the fear in his eyes. The men stopped, but their posture was tense, ready for anything. The taller one reached for his rifle, his movements deliberate. My stomach dropped. This was the kind of situation that could spiral out of control in seconds. Put it down, I yelled, my voice cracking. We're park rangers. You don't want to do this. The man hesitated, his hand resting on the weapon. His companion shifted uncomfortably, glancing around as if looking for an escape route. Finally, the taller man lowered the rifle, but his expression remained hard. What are you doing out here, I asked, keeping my flashlight trained on them. This is our land, the man growled. We hunt here. You don't have any right to stop us. Hunting is illegal in this park, I said firmly. In this trap, it's dangerous not just to animals, but to people. The man sneered. The law doesn't mean anything out here. We do what we need to survive. The tension in the air was suffocating. I knew we were outnumbered and unarmed, and these men didn't seem like the kind to back down easily. I had to think fast. Look, I said, softening my tone, we don't want trouble. We just want to make sure no one gets hurt. Why don't you come back with us to the station? We can figure this out. The man laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. You think we're stupid? You'll just lock us up. Maybe, I admitted, but if you stay out here, it's only a matter of time before someone else finds you, someone who won't give you a choice. The two men exchanged a look. They didn't trust us. That much was clear, but they were also weighing their options, trying to decide if running was worth the risk. Finally, the taller man sighed. Fine, he said grudgingly, we'll go with you, but if this is a trick, it's not, I said quickly. Let's just get out of here. The walk back to the truck felt endless. The forest seemed darker than ever, every shadow a potential threat. The poachers walked behind us, their footsteps heavy, their silence unnerving. My mind raced with what ifs. What if they tried to run? What if they turned on us? But the night passed without incident. When we finally reached the ranger station, relief washed over me. The men were booked, their weapons confiscated. It wasn't easy. They cursed and shouted defiant to the end, but we had done our job. Later, as I drove back to my cabin, the events of the night replayed in my mind, the growls, the trap, the confrontation. It all felt surreal. The forest, usually a place of peace and beauty, had shown me its darker side. It was a reminder of the delicate balance we walked as park rangers, protecting both the wilderness and those who entered it, whether they were visitors or intruders. That night, as I lay in bed listening to the distant howl of the wind, I realized something. The wilderness wasn't just a place, it was a test of courage, of patience, of strength. And though it scared me, I knew I would face it again, because some places, no matter how dangerous, are worth I've been a park ranger for over 15 years now, working in some of the most remote and rugged parts of the country, the kind of places where the air is thick with silence and the only sounds are the rustling of trees or the occasional distant cry of an animal. People often think of the outdoors as peaceful and serene, but as a ranger I've learned that the woods hide much darker things than most people realize. There's one story in particular that still makes my blood run cold whenever I think about. It happened a few years ago, and it changed how I view the wilderness forever. I was stationed in a large national park deep in the forest. The park was remote with few visitors, especially in the off-season when the weather turned colder. We had a handful of campgrounds, mostly for people who like to hike and enjoy the solitude, but there was always the risk of someone getting lost, or worse, someone having bad intentions. One cold November evening, I was on my usual patrol, just checking the campsites to make sure everything was secure. The sun had dipped behind the trees, leaving a cold bluish hue to the air, and the wind was starting to pick up. My truck's headlights illuminated the winding gravel road as I drove slowly, keeping an eye on the dark edges of the forest. I reached one of the remote campsites that wasn't often used. I noticed something unusual: a camper, an older RV, parked in a spot that was barely visible from the main road. Most people would have parked closer to the designated spots, but this one was way out in the trees. It was odd, but not unheard of. Sometimes people just wanted more privacy, or maybe they didn't know better, but something about it felt off. I pulled up beside the camper and honked the horn just to make sure someone was there. A minute passed, then 2-0. I got out of my truck and walked towards the camper, calling out, "Hey, you there?" No response. That's when I noticed the door was slightly ajar, swaying in the wind. I knocked gently on the side of the door frame and called out again, "Park ranger here, just checking on you. Doing okay?" Still nothing. A chill ran down my spine, and I decided to check inside. I wasn't expecting to find anything, just maybe someone asleep or unaware I was there. But when I peered in through the door, what I saw made my stomach drop. There in the dim light of the camper's interior was a man sitting perfectly still on the couch. He wasn't facing me, just staring straight ahead, unmoving. His clothes were disheveled, his hair a mess. I couldn't see his face clearly, but something was wrong. I called out to him again, but he didn't react. I took a step back and called my dispatcher, explaining the situation. I was still watching him through the window, trying to make sense of it, when I heard footsteps behind me. I spun around quickly, and a voice spoke from the darkness. "Is everything all right?" It was another camper, a man who had been staying at one of the closer SES. He looked concerned. I wasn't sure if I'd been jumpy or if I'd just not noticed him before, but I told him about the strange man in the RV. "That's strange," the camper said, looking at the camper wearily. "There's no way he could have gotten in there without anyone noticing." I nodded, then looked back at the RV. "Yeah, it's unsettling." I decided to call for backup, and the other camper agreed that it was a good idea. While we waited, I stayed a safe distance from the RV just in case. The air was thick with tension, and we exchanged glances every few seconds, as if expecting something to happen soon. Another ranger arrived along with a sheriff's deputy. Together we cautiously approached the camper. The man inside still hadn't moved. We made our way inside, and that's when I saw it. There was blood on the floor, a lot of it. My heart raced as I stepped closer, and there next to the couch was a large hunting knife. It was covered in red stains, as if someone had used it not too long ago. And the man, he wasn't just staring blankly. His face had been beaten, bruised, and swollen. Beyond recognition, his eyes were wide open, but there was no life left in them. We quickly stepped out, and the sheriff's deputy called for a forensic team. As we waited for them to arrive, we began talking about what had happened. The other camper who had spoken to me was visibly shaken. He told us he had seen the RV parked there for a couple of days, but hadn't noticed anything strange. He said he'd heard noises during the night like banging or shuffling, but he thought it was just the wind. But as we pieced the details together, it became clear that the man inside had likely been the victim of a violent crime. Someone had left him there to die, and the more we looked, the more we realized that whoever did this was still nearby. We spent hours combing through the area trying to find any clues that could lead us to the person responsible. The RV was a dead end except for the blood, and there were no other campers or hikers in the immediate area who had witnessed anything. Eventually, a man matching the description of a local drifter was found nearby, living in an old shack on the outskirts of the park. After questioning him, we discovered that he had been involved in a robbery gone wrong. The victim had been an acquaintance of his, someone who had owed him money for a long time. The man had killed him, taken his things, and left him in the RV to try to cover his tracks. He didn't expect anyone to find him out there. We arrested him, and the park was cleared of any further dangers, but the image of that man's lifeless eyes still haunts me. As a park ranger, I'm trained to deal with the wild, but nothing could have prepared me for the human side of the wilderness, the darkness that lurks in the hearts of people. It's easy to assume that the woods are dangerous because of wild animals or unpredictable weather, but in my experience, it's the people you need to worry about the most. I've encountered other strange situations in the years since, but none as chilling as that night. Sometimes the forest feels too quiet, too still, like it's hiding something, and when I see an RV parked in an isolated area, I can't help but feel a pang of unease, wondering if someone else is out there just waiting for the right moment